Welcome to Paranormal Nightshift, your ultimate destination for all things that go bump in the dark. This is where your fan-submitted stories come to life, and tonight we have a chilling tale to share. Before we dive in, don't forget to visit paranormalnightshift.com to grab your free copy of The Birth of Dimensional Desperado, the first ebook in the Dimensional Desperado series. It's a must-read for anyone who loves a good mix of the paranormal and the untamed Wild West. Now, let's get to tonight's story. This one comes from Matthew, and it's titled Immigration Camp. Settle in, night shifters. It's time to step into the shadows. Working in security for a government contractor comes with its own brand of challenges. Our primary job was to keep federal buildings secure, keep an eye on who comes in and out, and make sure government employees could work in peace. But things got interesting during COVID. We were assigned a temporary post at an immigration camp. This wasn't just any camp either. It housed hundreds, if not thousands, of minors who had crossed the border alone. There were other camps like this all over, and it was our job to make sure no one got in or out without clearance. This particular camp was set up on a military base, which made the job easier. We didn't have to deal with outsiders trying to sneak in, media poking around, or worst of all, predators trying to target the kids. The military presence kept everything locked down tight, so when I volunteered for the day shift, I figured it would be straightforward. And for the day shift, it was. My shifts were calm, even pleasant. But as the week went on, I started hearing whispers from the night shift. At first, it was just murmurs, things you'd hear around the break room, stories of disturbances in the building where the kids were kept. I didn't think much of it until I started noticing just how tired and uneasy the night shift guards looked. They seemed restless, disturbed, as if something was keeping them on edge. The building housing the kids was an old military dorm, 3 stories tall, and each room could fit 4 kids. It was a sturdy building, built to last, and since it was fenced off, it felt secure. But apparently, something was keeping those kids up at night. They'd been telling the adults about a spirit that would come into their rooms, shaking their beds, waking them up, and sending them into a panic. Naturally, the staff brushed it off. Kids get scared at night. Anyone who's worked with children knows how active their imaginations can be, especially in strange places. But then, halfway through the week, things escalated. One night, the kids bolted out of their rooms, screaming and crying, refusing to go back inside. They clung to the adults, pleading, shaking in fear. When they finally calmed down enough to talk, one of the boys recounted what he had seen. According to him, he'd woken up in the middle of the night to a dark, oppressive presence in the room. As he scanned the darkened room, he noticed a black mass hovering over one of his roommates, a dense, shapeless shadow that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The other boy was lying frozen, his eyes wide and locked on the figure, paralyzed with fear. The first boy finally found the courage to scream, and in an instant the figure vanished. The room erupted in panic, and the kids fled into the hallway, still screaming as they sought out the adults. But despite their insistence, no one believed them. They brushed it off as a bad dream or some elaborate prank. After all, there was no way anything like that could happen on a military base, right? But the stories didn't stop, and that's when the higher-ups decided to review the CCTV footage, thinking maybe it was one of the employees sneaking in to mess with the kids, or maybe another kid playing a prank. They gathered around the monitors, hoping for a simple explanation. What they saw was anything but simple. In the footage, a shadow could be seen moving down the hallway, an unnatural, formless blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. As they watched, It glided silently down the hall, turning and slipping into the room where the kids were sleeping. Moments later, the children were seen scrambling out of the room, wild with terror. The footage was shown to all the employees, even the on-site doctors. The staff needed to know that these kids weren't crazy, and they needed proof. I remember hearing the story and feeling a chill run through me. It was Thursday night, and the camp staff decided they couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. They told the kids that a priest would come on Saturday as part of the weekly church service, and that he'd do something to help. But the story didn't end there. The main child, the one who had first seen the figure, hadn't been sleeping. His nights had been filled with terror, and he'd refused to close his eyes for fear of what might come for him. That night, one of the doctors gave him a sleeping pill, trying to ease his suffering, to help him get just one night of rest. But in the morning, when they went to check on him, they found him sitting up, clutching the sleeping pill in his hand, tears streaming down his face. He told them the spirit had spoken to him, warning him in a voice as cold as death. "If you take that pill, you will die." The staff didn't know what to do. Everyone was on edge. Even the hardened night shift workers, who'd been in some of the roughest areas and seen things that would make most people's skin crawl, were shaken. The priest arrived that Saturday, escorted to the building by some of the employees. I remember seeing him from my station at the entrance, watching as he was led in, his face calm but serious. I hadn't yet heard the full story, but even without knowing, I could feel something heavy in the air that day, an unease that clung to everyone's steps. A few days later, the story started spreading, and I finally learned why the priest had come. The tale of what had happened, the shadow, the kids' fear, the warnings, had everyone talking. 2 years later, I happened to run into a former co-worker from that job. We found ourselves reminiscing, and somehow the events of that week came up. I cautiously brought up the story, half expecting him to laugh it off, to tell me it was just some campfire tale that had gotten out of hand. But he didn't laugh. He nodded gravely, telling me he'd seen the footage himself. He'd watched the shadow glide down that hallway and slip into the room. And then he told me something I hadn't known, a detail that made my blood run cold. He told me that when the first incident had occurred, the staff had initially offered to move the kids to another room, hoping it might help. Maybe, they thought, if the ghost was real, it was tied to that room specifically. Maybe it was the restless spirit of a soldier, angry or disturbed, bound to that one spot. But when they offered to switch rooms, the boy shook his head and said, "It won't help. It's attached to me." According to the boy, he and his family had crossed through a haunted forest on their journey to America. He and his friends had played around in the woods, taunting the spirits, laughing at the stories of curses and dark figures. He believed that something had followed him from that forest, that it had attached itself to him and refused to let go. I still think about that boy sometimes, wondering what became of him, if he ever managed to escape whatever it was that had latched onto him. But since it happened on government property, those details are locked away, probably never to see the light of day. But one thing's certain, whatever walked through that hallway that night was as real as the fear on those kids' faces. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering just what kind of force could reach across continents and attach itself to a single person, following them even into the safety of a military base. With that being said, Matthew, thank you so much for sharing your incredible story with us tonight. And to all our listeners, if you have a story of your own that you'd like to submit, you can do so right here on Paranormal Nightshift. We'd love to hear from you. Now, If you enjoy the show and want to support what we do, you can join us on Patreon for an ad-free experience. Plus, as a patron, you'll gain exclusive access to all future journeys in the Dimensional Desperado ebook series. Don't want to join Patreon? No problem. You can still subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and YouTube. And while you're there, drop us a comment and let us know what you thought about this episode. Your feedback means the world to us. And before you go, make sure to visit paranormalnightshift.com to grab your free copy of The Birth of Dimensional Desperado, the first ebook in the series. It's a story you won't want to miss. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Paranormal Nightshift.